Welcome back to our afternoon session of the Ellen White Issues Symposium. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kevin Burton, who is the Director of the Center for Adventist Research and Assistant Director of the Ellen G. White Estate. He's an Assistant Professor in the Church History Department at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary at Andrews University. He concentrates his research on Millerite and Seventh-day Adventist history, with a particular interest in the topics of race and gender, apocalypticism, and politics and the state. His MA thesis is titled Centralized for Protection, George I, Butler and His Philosophy of One-Person Leadership. And some of his recent publications include Cracking the Whip to Make a Perfect Church, The Purge of the Battle Creek on April 6, 1870, John Wesley Kelchner, founder of the Temple Restoration Movement, a Freemason's attempt to build a world chain of Solomon's Temple for global peace, and his Ph.D. dissertation explores Adventist political involvement in the abolition movement. Welcome, Dr. Burton. His topic today will be James White's First Stroke and Rising Tension Between Adventist Leaders. I'd like to remind you that you have 40 minutes before your presentation, but before I give you the floor, let's bow our heads for a very short word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for being with us through this first half of this afternoon session. We ask for your presence as we unpack this topic, be with our speaker, and give us attentive ears so we can hear the message that you have for us today. We love you and praise you for just being this awesome God that you are. I pray all this in your precious name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. It's good to be with you. I guess I will read a paper here in front of the video, and you can follow along well. The introduction here. Some of the basic details of this paper will be familiar to Adventist scholars and those familiar with Adventist history. The fact that James White had a major stroke in 1865 and suffered through a prolonged illness has been noted in numerous publications. But the challenges that James White's first stroke presented to the Adventist Church have not been sufficiently explored or adequately understood. This paper seeks to enrich our understanding of these events while offering some correctives to the historiography. First, scholars have minimized or ignored the tension between the Whites and key Adventist leaders, and I mean in the very immediate period here in 1866 and 67, that developed because of James White's first stroke and extended illness. Those authors who have briefly acknowledged a controversy have either not named the Whites' antagonists, presented them as the Whites' defenders, or myopically suggested that the conflict was between the Whites and some innocuous group they've called fellow church members. With few exceptions, scholars have tended to portray the situation between August 1865 and the summer of 1867 as merely a crisis over James White's health that spurred Adventist health reform. This effectively masks much of the reality. As demonstrated in this paper, conflict arose between the Whites and their closest friends and top church leaders. I will name them: Jane Andrews, Jan Loughborough, Uriah and Harriet Smith, George and Martha Amidon, Martha and Cornelia Cornell, Ira Abbey, and his daughter Lucinda Hall. During this period, these leaders expressed distrust and disrespect for the leadership of both James and Ellen White, even though they were their closest friends. As a result, it is important to understand how this crisis developed and what issues were at stake. Second, it has been assumed that the distrust and disrespect caused by James White's occasional severity in his management. However, as demonstrated in this paper, James White did not attempt to manage the leaders of the Adventist Church between August 1865 and the summer of 1867. Rather, he struggled with depression and his diet during these years, and it was for these reasons that his closest friends too often criticized, gossiped, and ridiculed. Third, scholars have analyzed non- and ex-Adventist critiques of Ellen White's prophetic gift, and some historians have paid comparatively little attention to the fact that Adventists who remained in the church sometimes harbored doubts about her prophetic gift and role. It was, in fact, sometimes difficult for even leading Adventists to accept a prophet within their midst, someone with human weaknesses and occasional apparent errors in judgment. Fourth, scholars have often failed to recognize the depth of Ellen White's struggle as she nursed her husband to health. Many writers have portrayed Ellen White as a dedicated wife who tirelessly nursed James White to health with heroic determination and fortitude. Some have even gone so far as to claim that she accomplished this feat while staying active in church leadership. Closely connected with these incorrect assumptions is the notion that Ellen White maintained her belief with decided and unwavering faith that God would fully heal her husband. By contrast, this paper reveals that many Adventists assisted Ellen White in caring for James, notes her struggles with depression during this period, and documents her occasional doubts that God would restore her husband to health as he had shown her in vision. James White's first stroke. On the morning of August 16, 1865, James and Ellen White were in Noah Lunt's garden taking their usual walk before breakfast. James White was worn from the lack of proper sleep and stress from challenges raised by the recently ended Civil War, the rise of the Marian Party, and the constant pressure from his publishing work. As the Whites walked, James stopped, picked a piece of corn, and started to open it. Then, quote, a sudden dizziness seized him and his right arm fell powerless at his side, end quote. White had been stricken by what contemporaries called a partial shock of paralysis. Sometimes they called it a stroke as well. In addition to affecting his right arm below the elbow, this stroke also affected his brain and power of speech. Since James did not fall to the ground, Ellen was able to help him stagger into the Lunt's home. Once inside, James was able to utter one word several times, pray. The couple dropped to their knees in earnest petition, and James soon uttered words of praise and gratitude that to God that he could use his arm a little bit again. 2 days later, he was taken on a lounge to his house. By then, White was able to move the fingers of his paralyzed hand and used the hand to some extent. His mind was also somewhat free and the power of speech restored. For the next 3 weeks, James was bedridden, suffering from extreme nervousness, want of sleep, excessive sweating, and then chills. Due to his feeble condition, he had to be carefully watched throughout the night. During the first week, Myron and Cornelia Cornell watched James White every other night, while Ellen White likely observed her husband on the alternate nights. By the second week, Uriah and Harriet Smith and George and Martha Amidon were also taking turns, allowing each couple to keep vigil every third night. The Smiths, Amidons, and Cornells aided Ellen White for several weeks, sometimes all day and night, and were encouraged when James White would make a little progress. On August 27, he was dressed for the first time since his attack of sickness and with assistance walked a few steps. Then 2 weeks later, on September 10, he actually walked about 3/10 of a mile from his house to the office, the publishing office. Even though they grew exhausted during this time, the Cornells, Smiths, and Amidons considered it an honor and privilege to care for James White. Cornelia Cornell wrote to Lucinda Abbey Hall, quote, we all feel deeply afflicted in the sickness of Brother White and pray it may be sanctified to the good of us all. We truly believe that the Lord will restore him to health and he has a great work for him to do, end quote. During the first weeks after his stroke, many things were attempted to restore James to health. After trying electric treatment with a battery, Ellen felt that James needed hydrotherapy, but there was no one in Battle Creek who dared take the responsibility of administering water. As a result, the Whites agreed it might be duty to travel to Dansville, New York, and receive the medical attention from Dr. James Caleb Jackson at our home on the hillside. Uriah Smith telegraphed Dr. Horatio Lay, an Adventist physician who had been studying with Dr. Jackson in Dansville, requesting that he take James White to our home for treatment. Dr. Lay responded quickly, arriving in Battle Creek on September 8. Lay observed that their recent trials had also placed Ellen White in feeble health, and many others, including Jan Loughborough, Uriah Smith, and Mary Frances Maxon, were likewise unwell. As a result, on September 14, the quote, Seventh-day Invalid Party left Battle Creek by train under the care of Dr. Lay. On September 20, the group arrived at the depot in Wayland, New York, and then took a stagecoach the last 7 miles to Dansville. The following morning, Smith reported that Brother and Sister White were cordially welcomed by Dr. Jackson, physician-in-chief of our home. The Whites remained at our home for about 3 months. During this period, they decided to stay in a room nearby the health facility rather than at the institute itself, probably to save money. Every morning, they would walk up the hillside to meet their appointments for the day at the institute. During this time, they were both able to walk out and be in the open air much of the time, and every day except Sabbath and the first day they took treatment. Dr. Jackson termed his method of treatment psychohygienic, and it involved numerous aspects, including various types of baths, a healthy diet, proper dress, abundant rest and quiet, plenty of fresh air and sunshine, and various amusements to keep people happy. On December 7, 1865, the Whites left our home in the midst of a drizzling rainstorm and made the 7-mile journey to Wayland in an open carriage. After resting in the depot, the Whites took a sleeping car to Rochester, where Jonathan Orton met them with an easy and convenient hack. The Whites then rode on horseback 3 miles to the home of Bradley Lamson, where they remained for about 3 weeks. On Christmas Day, Ellen White received an encouraging vision from the Lord, and after telling James about it, he suggested that they return to Battle Creek New Year's evening. On January 2, 1866, the Whites received a warm welcome from their friends in Battle Creek. James had endured the journey well, but had lost about 50 pounds since the previous August, and dramatically had aged in appearance. Still very feeble, it would still be more than a year before he would finally return to his post. The agonizing year of captivity and journey east. Arthur L. White referred to 1866 as the agonizing year of captivity for James White. In 1866 and 1867, he was not, as one biographer has imagined, under the, quote, constant burden of leadership from the publishing staff and general conference officers who haggled him with questions. Rather, throughout the year, James was inactive and spent much of his time lying down on a bed or sofa. Because he was entirely disengaged from any kind of work, White admitted that for a year and a half, he, quote, carried neither watch nor purse, denoting his lack of concern for either time or money. His brain had been deeply affected by the stroke, and White later admitted that he had, quote, greatly erred when in a condition of the paralysis of the brain. But he clarified that he had erred and sinned against himself, not his brethren. Historians have assumed that James White became harsher and more critical of his colleagues after his first stroke, but this reality manifested itself after his second stroke, not the first. Writing in February 1866, Martha Amidon observed, quote, when Brother White came home, in many respects he seemed changed and does still in some. He is very kind and takes no care whatever of anything or anybody but himself, end quote. During his prolonged illness, which elapsed from August 1865 to the summer of 1867, James did not attempt to tightly control things in Battle Creek as he had previously done and would again do. Rather, his errors, as he called them, were related to his depression and diet. Though she had not been stricken with paralysis in 1866, 1866 was also an agonizing year for Ellen White. After returning to Battle Creek on January 2, the Whites maintained a fairly positive attitude until about mid-February. By the end of the month, contemporaries observed that discouragement reigns at Brother White's, and Martha Amidon explained the situation to Lucinda Hall in a letter. She wrote, Brother White is still about so. He seems better in some respects, but does not think so himself. He looks upon the dark side a great deal and has to have her, that's Ellen White, to keep talking courage and hope most of the time. Had it not been for her faithful efforts, he would doubtless have been in his grave ere this. She is an exception to all woman or mankind. I never saw a person brave through everything as she does. That's quite an heroic statement. Ellen certainly had exerted a concerted effort to save her husband, but it came at a cost to her own physical and mental health. Martha Amidon continued in this letter, stating, we have found that she, Ellen White, could become discouraged of late, and maybe if she goes down, he, James White, will come up faster. This year was agonizing also for the Battle Creek Church, as leaders assisted the Whites in every way that they could. As Ellen White remarked, they all felt that James White's stroke had fallen upon them, and our affliction they made their own, she said. The church convened several meetings to discuss James's condition and to organize assistance for the Whites. They held weekly prayer meetings and even observed a fast day. The Smiths, Amidons, and Cornells cared for the Whites fairly regularly, and others such as Adelia and Isaac Van Horn periodically assisted when in town. But when the White situation worsened in mid-February 1866, the church decided that they should have 24-hour assistance. So on February 11, Anna M. Driscoll moved into the Whites' home to take care of the housework. Generally, her services were appreciated, but on May 5, a conflict arose that placed Anna Driscoll and Edson White on one side and James and Ellen White on the other. Edson remained defiant and Anna promptly moved out. Harriet Smith intervened 3 days later by meeting separately with Anna and Ellen to discuss the problem. After her mediation, Anna apologized to James White and returned to her duties, moving back into the home. Anna continued to live in the Whites' home until she left for school in Albion, Michigan on September 18, 1866. The day before she departed, the Battle Creek Church gave her $30 and thanked her for her services. Anna's assistance was appreciated, but it seemed that nothing could alleviate Ellen White's burden. James remained depressed and feeble, and Ellen admitted that he might be insane. It is evident by that her own sanity was at times in question. From mid-February to mid-May, she constantly battled anxiety and depression alongside her husband. On March 10, she admitted that during the past week, she had carried the heaviest heart and felt the worst she had ever did in a week in her life. April 17 was an especially difficult day. Harriet Smith wrote in her diary, "Sister White had a very bad time today, was crazy, fainted, etc. Uriah Smith and others went and prayed for her a long time and left her better." End quote. A few days later, Cornelia Cornell reported that Sister White is very poorly and grows old, poor woman. She has had enough to make her look old. For the past 8 months, it has been affliction, trials, and distress. By mid-May, as sunshine and warmth returned to Michigan, Ellen was rallying her strength and claimed that the Lord was blessing Brother White and their captivity was turning. But others observed that things at the White's house remained truly distressing throughout the summer. The situation had to change, and during the fall, Ellen tried a new tactic: travel. On September 11, 1866, she left Battle Creek with Willie and James with a threefold objective. First, to see her dying father before he passed. Second, to attend the meetings in New York State. And third, to encourage her husband to be more active. During this trip, Ellen was very stressed and James remained very feeble. Unable to complete the journey, Ellen had to leave her husband in Brookfield, New York, and with the Abbey family and travel to see her dying father without her or Willie. She did so with the knowledge that she might not see James again. While she was gone, the Abbeys informed her that James's condition had worsened, and she wrote to Edson, "Your father grows feebler every day. He is very white and his face is pinched. I do not think he will live over a month. He is liable to die any day or night. We have sent for your aunts, Mary and Lizzie, to come immediately if they would see your father alive." But James survived, and it was primarily due to the constant care of Lucinda Hall that she had given him at her parents' home. Though it taxed Lucinda's strength and patience, James improved enough to return home. On November 14, 1866, he and Ellen reached Battle Creek, but to the astonishment of her friends, Ellen was planning to take James on another trip about a week later. The leaders in Battle Creek protested, and on November 22, the day before the Whites planned to leave, Ellen was called into a meeting in the publishing office. On this occasion, J.N. Andrews lectured her, demanding that she must not take James on another journey because it would do Brother White no good, and it was sure to sadden the hearts of the brethren in Battle Creek. Adventist leaders in Battle Creek were done. They had lost hope that James White would ever recover during the Whites' journey east. When the Whites returned, the doctors at the recently established Western Health Reform Institute, that later becomes Battle Creek Sanitarium, or at least takes that name, told Ellen, quote, "You will not realize your expectations. There was never known a case when one afflicted with the paralysis of the brain recovered." They now pressured Ellen to cease caring for her husband so that her life and ministry could be continued unhindered. In October, Cornelia Cornell wrote, quote, "Earnest and fervent shall be our praying that the Lord may help her, Ellen White, bear her affliction and yet permit her to be free to bear her testimony among the people of God." Previously, Adventist leaders had prayed that God would liberate both of the Whites from their affliction. However, by the fall of 1866, they dropped James from the prayer list and began to consider him dead weight, someone who restrained God and Ellen White. Ellen got the message and later wrote with frustration, quote, "They all felt that I was sacrificing my life in shouldering this burden, and that for the sake of my children, for the cause of God, I should do all within my power to preserve my life." In November 1866, Ellen White was faced with a difficult choice: accept the expert medical advice and follow the exhortations of her closest friends, or stand alone in the care of her husband with little evidence that God was with her. Though she had passed through many moments of doubt, she chose to reject the opinions of Adventist doctors and spurn the pleading of her friends, resolving that God will raise James up. This was not easy. On the evening of November 22, shortly after Jane Andrews and others had told Ellen White to give up on James, Harriet Smith, Martha Amidon, and Cornelia Cornell attempted to visit Ellen in her home, but Ellen refused to see them, and they were offended. Harriet wrote in her diary that evening that this was most wretched indeed. 2 days later, Ellen called on Harriet Smith at her home to make amends and confided in Harriet, Martha, and Cornelia as she had done many other times in the past. Though cordial in person, these women had grown callous. That evening, Harriet noticed James writing some confessions to his brethren and cynically wrote in her diary, "It is doubtful how long-lasting they will be." Also that evening, Cornelia wrote a letter to Lucinda Hall filled with unkind gossip about the Whites. For the next 3.5 weeks, Ellen contemplated taking James to northern Michigan, and the leaders in Battle Creek persistently discouraged her efforts. Even John and Betsy White tearfully pleaded with Ellen to give up on their son. She had done all that was in her power, and she must not attempt impossibilities. But Ellen was convinced that ministering in northern Michigan was her only hope of seeing James recover. She assured her in-laws, "As long as life is left in him and me, I will make every exertion for him. That brain, that noble, masterly mind shall not be left in ruin. God will care for him, for me, for my children. Satan shall not exult over us. You will yet see us standing side by side in the sacred desk, speaking the words of truth unto eternal life." End quote. Labor and discouragement in northern Michigan. Despite considerable opposition, the Whites departed for Wright, Michigan on December 19, 1866, in the middle of a snowstorm. In hindsight, Ellen acted prudently, for it was at Wright that they both commenced their first effective labors since the sickness of James. Ellen explained how James progressed in his feebleness. He began to preach for 30 or 40 minutes in the mornings, and she would fill up the rest of the time in the morning and speak for about an hour and a half in the afternoons. For the next 6 weeks, James grew stronger, clearer, and more connected in his subjects, and spoke a total of 12 times. As James slowly recovered, Ellen resumed her writing. She explained, quote, "As our labors with this church in Wright progressed, individual cases began to open before me, and I commenced writing out testimonies for them." She continued, "I wrote many letters besides the many pages of personal testimonies, and most of testimony for the church number 11, end quote. This ended 3 years of prophetic silence in the Adventist church. Ellen White's last testimony had been published in January 1864, but testimony for the church number 11 did not appear until February 1867. During these years, many Adventists relaxed their beliefs and lost interest in the cause. Similarly, the Battle Creek Church acknowledged that they had suffered without James White's active leadership, stating, quote, we also believe that God has called Brother White to bear plain testimony in reproving wrongs. We have learned by painful experience also that when these testimonies are silent or their warning lightly regarded, coldness, backsliding, worldly mindedness, and spiritual darkness take possession of the church." As the Whites returned to active ministry, the conflict they faced with leaders in Battle Creek in the past fall followed them northward. Ira Abbey, a wealthy Adventist from New York, came to Battle Creek in early January with his wife, Rhoda, and daughter, Lucinda Abbey Hall. Ira Abbey had come to Battle Creek to help the directors of the Health Institute fundraise for their elaborate new building project. Before his arrival, the Battle Creek Church had notified him and his family that Ellen White wanted to take James on another journey. This news alarmed the Abbeys because James had nearly died at their home on the Whites' journey east a few months earlier. Another journey was surely unwise. When the Abbeys arrived in Battle Creek in early January, the leaders there, particularly the Smiths, Amidons, and Cornells, informed them that the Whites had left already, and it added that their actions were contrary to the opinion and advice of the church and those standing at the head of the work at Battle Creek. The Abbeys then promptly traveled north, presumably to reason with the Whites. Upon their arrival in mid-January, Ira Abbey began to represent James White as being partially insane. When they returned to Battle Creek, the Abbeys then informed the leaders that the Whites were publicly criticizing them in Wright. These rumors apparently confirmed suspicions, I put that in scare quotes, confirmed suspicions that Battle Creek leaders had already harbored. About this time, Ellen White had a dream about the situation in Battle Creek. In this dream, Ellen White was led around to Adventist houses in the city. At each one, she heard the name of her husband frequently mentioned and was grieved and astonished to hear their firmest professed friends making such slanderous remarks. She was grieved to hear the voice of Ira Abbey representing in an earnest manner and in an exaggerated light incidents which those in Battle Creek were ignorant of, while the friends in Battle Creek in their turn related that which they knew. As she watched and listened, Ellen began to realize that these rumors were, as she says, their present truth. She awoke in sorrow and preached the next Sabbath on Philippians 4:8, emphasizing Paul's exhortation to think on things pure and lovely. Shortly after the Abbeys left Wright, Jan Loughborough came to that town to hold some meetings and created further tension. Before journeying to Wright, he too had been warned by the Smiths, Amidons, and Cornells not to get under the Whites' influence. As a result, Loughborough remained distant from the Whites during his visit between January 25 and 30. Since the Whites were unaware of Loughborough's distrust, his less than friendly attitude confused them both. Throughout the spring, Loughborough's distrust grew, and after returning to Battle Creek in February, he worked with other leaders to turn others against the Whites. Ellen White later complained to Loughborough, when Brother Sanford Rogers came back from Wright in sympathy with us, you got hold of him and turned him square about. During the Whites' labor in northern Michigan, they also received several letters from Battle Creek of a discouraging character. Ellen White probably received a demoralizing from her good friend Lucinda Hall at this time. After Ellen White's first dream and the distressing visit from the Abbeys in Loughborough, she wrote a letter to Lucinda Abbey, which hasn't survived, pleading with her to correct the wrong understanding that existed in her family. Ellen mentioned that the Battle Creek Church had grown indifferent to their needs and no longer sympathized with them in their affliction. She also related her recent dream to Lucinda and wanted to know why the Abbeys had gossiped about her and James in Battle Creek. Lucinda responded with a callous tone, showing suspicion and disbelief in Ellen White's view of Battle Creek. She began, quote, "We have just received your letter, and I have read it over several times. Some part of it I do not understand. You say you have learned a good lesson, not to trust a friend, neither put confidence in a brother. I am not sensible of ever betraying the confidence of anyone." End quote. Lucinda then expressed doubt in Ellen's assessment in Battle Creek Church. "When I went to Battle Creek," she wrote, "I was surprised to see them so devoted to your interests. Sister Harriet, Martha, and Cornelia were hurrying and perplexing themselves. And I remember making some remark to the effect that their labors were not realized or appreciated." End quote. Lucinda defended her friends in Battle Creek, confidently claiming that even though the Whites felt injured, she believed the truth to be different, as she said, from their perspectives. Lucinda also defended her actions and that of her parents, asserting, quote, "I do not think we told them any news in Battle Creek. We have been very careful not to make your trials public." Lucinda Hall was particularly annoyed with Ellen White's dream. She claimed, "In regard to your dream, it is very certain that a part of it is not correct, if any of it." Lucinda then blamed Jane Rogers for gossiping about the Whites, but also claimed that Jane had not shared any of this gossip with her family. She then reported that her family had scolded Brother Alonzo for mentioning just a word in regard to Brother White's eating, and that the Abbeys had charged their hired girl to be careful of what she said about James White. In this letter, Lucinda revealed that the Abbeys did not believe their friends in Battle Creek had turned against the Whites. They felt innocent and guiltless and believed that if anyone was at fault, it must be James and Ellen White. Lucinda even accused James White of slandering her behind her back. Therefore, with great annoyance, Lucinda coldly responded to Ellen White, "You wish me to clear matters up. Now, if I knew what to do, I would be about it. I have lived in your family and always felt a union with you that has never been broken till now." Ellen White was disheartened by her friend's visits, her distressing dream, and discouraging letters. Since James was still feeble, Ellen did her best not to burden him with her feelings, even as she began to lose sleep over her arising problem. Ellen admitted, "None knew the labor or burden upon my mind, and I sought to lay my burden upon the great burden bearer." The Whites returned to Battle Creek. On January 29, 1867, the Whites left Wright and traveled roughly 40 miles east to Greenville, Michigan. After spending 5 weeks with the Maynard family, the Whites began to work their way back to Battle Creek on March 4, making several stops along the way. As they traveled, Ellen grew uneasy, sensing that they would be unwelcome at home. On the night of March 6, she had a second alarming dream about Battle Creek, and she wrote, "That night, I dreamed I was in Battle Creek looking out from the side glass at the door, and I saw a company marching up to the house 2 by 2. They looked stern and determined. I knew them well and turned to open the parlor door to receive them, but thought I would look again. The scene was changed. The appearance now presented was like a Catholic procession. One of the company bore in his hand a cross, another had a reed. And as they neared the house, the one carrying the reed made a circle around the house, saying 3 times, 'This house is proscribed. The goods must be confiscated. They have spoken against our holy order.' Ellen White was terrified and tried to escape out the back door, but she found herself trapped. She attempted to flee, but could not escape the crowd's determined watch. As she prayed, she watched in horror as her goods were confiscated. She kept repeating the phrase, 'If I could only understand this, if they would just tell me what I have said or what I have done.' But no one listened or came to aid her. She then awoke with her pillow wet with tears. On March 13, the Whites arrived in Battle Creek and received an apathetic greeting that they expected. James was very anxious to see his brethren in Battle Creek and speak with them and rejoice with them with what God was doing for him. However, he was terribly disappointed at the cold reception he met from all the people there. Instead of being joyous at the Whites' return and acknowledging James's evident progress in health, the people in Battle Creek were inexcusably neglectful and cruel. That's a quote. During the Whites' 12-week absence from Battle Creek, Harriet Smith, Martha Amidon, and Cornelia Cornell had spread gossip around the church. Cornelia later admitted, quote, "My feelings when the Whites came from northern Michigan in 1867 were wicked. Instead of having feelings of pity, love, and tenderness, it was the reverse. The devil was leading and I was under his control," end quote. Harriet Smith explained, quote, "Gossiping had become the order of the day, and during Brother Abbey's previous visit, and all the while, matters were talked over and brought upon us the frown of God," end quote. Likewise, Martha confessed later, "Notwithstanding the deep affliction into which Brother and Sister White were plunged, all my sympathies were dormant and my heart was hard as stone, and they were left to suffer in our midst," end quote. Between November 1866 and mid-1867, many Adventists lost confidence in Ellen White's ministry and leadership, and what remaining respect they had for James disappeared. On February 10, 1867, Cornelia Cornell wrote to Lucinda Hall, who had recently returned with her mother to Brookfield, New York, that, quote, "Brother White keeps sending in his reports to the review office. They have to cut out a slice occasionally. I do not think he will bear it much longer. How do you think he will talk to the office hands for daring to keep back what he sends in," end quote. Cornelia, Harriet, and Martha felt uneasy when they learned through these reports that James's health was improving. They believed that if he recovered and returned to his post, he would strictly manage their husbands as he had done before his stroke. Harriet Smith later admitted, quote, "When we saw those pieces in the paper, we thought that if Brother White should come up and do as he had done, have the same spirit of cutting and slashing as he had, we should go into despair." Cornelia also critically discussed Ellen White's testimonies. At this time, Ellen White faced difficulties in writing testimony for the church number 11, in part because the leaders in Battle Creek had delayed its publication by pressuring her to add a section promoting the newly established Health Institute. Ellen White attempted to meet this request, but had reservations because the Institute directors were unwisely pushing for a large new building before it was needed or could be financed. As Ellen delayed, Cornelia critically remarked that, quote, "Ellen thought if there was any fault in her writing, it was because she did not have James's clear head to help her and thought she had better throw up writing altogether until she could have it," end quote. Cornelia had lost confidence in Ellen White's prophetic gift after she witnessed her long struggle with depression, her apparently unwise efforts to raise James to health. If Ellen could show apparent disregard for sound counsel from God's leaders in Battle Creek, and if her testimonies were so dependent upon James's clear head, how could they be divinely inspired? With this rationale, Cornelia increasingly cast doubt upon the testimonies, and Ellen White had to confront the issue immediately after the General Conference of 1867 had closed. But Cornelia was not alone. Ellen White had a third dream in the first night spent in Battle Creek that involved Harriet Smith, Martha Amidon, and Cornelia Cornell, and further illustrates the growing distrust in her prophetic ministry. In this dream, Ellen had been laboring very hard and been traveling for the purpose of attending a large meeting. She was very weary, and the sisters were arranging her hair and adjusting her dress. As they did this, Ellen fell asleep. She's falling asleep in her dream, I should say. When she awoke in her dream, she was astonished and indignant to find that her garments had been removed, and there had been placed upon her old rags and pieces of bed quilts knotted and sewed together. She cried out, "Bring back my garments, which I have worn these 23 years since 1844, and have not disgraced them in a single instance. Unless you give me back my garments, I shall appeal to the people who will contribute and return to me my own garments, which I have worn these 23 years." After recounting this experience, Ellen stated, "I have seen the fulfillment of this dream." Since Harriet Smith, Martha Amidon, and Cornelia Cornell were closely connected with the cause at large and closely connected with the heart of the work, their doubts quickly spread and infected the minds of other leaders in the church. This was clear before the Whites returned to Battle Creek on March 13, 1867. Uriah Smith, George Amidon, and Myron Cornell were especially affected, but the influence of these women did not stop with their spouses. Jan Loughborough, Jan Andrews, Ira Abbey, and many others shared the doubts that these women expressed. Due to their fractured relationships, the actions of everyone involved were routinely mistrust and the actions of everyone involved were routinely misunderstood and misinterpreted by the other party as personal affronts. As Battle Creek became a discouraging place for the Whites, they contemplated moving. They were attracted to Greenville because few ministers traveled through the area and the people were spiritually hungry. In fact, men had come from 10 to 15 miles on foot, and aged and feeble women had come from 3 to 12 miles on foot during the winter to hear the Whites speak. In northern Michigan, the Whites' services were needed and appreciated, and the Adventists here let the leaders in Battle Creek know it. Shortly before the Whites returned to Battle Creek, 68 Adventists from Montcalm and Ionia County signed a petition asking the Whites to locate in their midst, and they mailed it to Battle Creek. This petition raised suspicions among leaders in Battle Creek. Had the Whites grown tired of the people in Battle Creek? Did they not care about the friends or work in Battle Creek anymore? Were they speaking against the Battle Creek Church everywhere they traveled, stating that God was no longer among this congregation? In addition to this, James White chose to officially resign his position in the Publishing Association upon its return to Battle Creek in March 1867. Due to his feebleness, he had not worked for the Adventist Church throughout 1866, but he still was still officially president of the General Conference and Publishing Association. His resignation was then taken as an insult at this time, and this matter was deferred until the next General Conference session. In the face of these developments, the Whites tried to reassure their friends that they were not abandoning them, but their guarded response concealed the fact that they did want some distance from their friends. James White's Sermon on Sanctification. These issues were exacerbated by James White's sermons in early March. On March 16, the first Sabbath the Whites were back in Battle Creek, he preached on sanctification, and Uriah Smith transcribed it phonographically and printed it in the review. James White's primary text was 2 Peter 1, 1 through 11, in which the apostle exhorts, and add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity, or as we now say, love. James White began this sermon with a brief discussion of virtue and knowledge. After this, he moved to the topic of temperance and patience, which comprised the bulk of his sermon. As he discussed this subject, he moved on from one subtopic to the next, becoming more direct with the congregation as the sermon progressed. The first subtopic was within this category related to liquors. However, James White recognized that there were none present who were guilty of its use, and quickly moved on to a topic that hit a little closer to home: tobacco. Excuse me. White gave several illustrations denouncing tobacco and responded to many arguments in its favor. From tobacco, White came still a little closer, discussing tea and coffee. He admitted, "I have no doubt, but this remark will hit some in this congregation. But I shall not offend you, because I shall appeal to facts which you acknowledge to be facts." James then explained that he did not consider coffee and tea to be equal to tobacco in regard to filth, but did consider them to be equally injurious upon the human system. White considered eating flesh meats to be the greatest form of intemperance for Adventists in Battle Creek, and he preached on this subject at length. He added to this the importance of bran and graham flour, the benefits of a 2-meal-per-day diet, and the necessity of dress reform. In closing, he briefly discussed godliness and brotherly kindness and ended with love. He claimed it is true charity that leads me to speak plainly and encourage active reform. The apostles' system of sanctification consists in doing something, We repeat, consists in doing something. This is what this we are to do through Christ helping us, end quote. This sermon was critically received in Battle Creek. John White was apparently a little stirred, if not displeased, by his own son's sermon. He informed a friend, quote, James preached last Sabbath 2 hours on Peter's text of addition, and when he came to temperance, he had much to say about tobacco. I was really afraid that they would think the boy had been taking some of the filthy weed, or that he was giving the discourse merely for my benefit. Add to this all the sitting for 2 hours, my mouth tasted unnatural, but I found a remedy for that as soon as I got out of the crowd. Apparently, John White did not want to give up his tobacco. While there were probably also complaints about James's statement on coffee and tea, people in Battle Creek were primarily disturbed by what he said about food. Just before his stroke, James experimented with health reform, eating no meat but grains, fruits, and vegetables simply cooked. However, he struggled to maintain a simple diet after his stroke. White was never overweight in his life and may have weighed on average between 175 and 180 pounds. During his prolonged sickness, however, he had lost at least 50 pounds by the end of 1865 and was described as, quote, thin in flesh and boned over. Eating was a challenge for James, and he attributed it to a weak stomach, specifically dyspepsia or indigestion. Dr. Jackson had stressed that White needed a simple vegetarian meal twice daily, and Ellen followed the doctor's orders, actively encouraging James to reform his diet so that he could recover his strength. But James frequently resisted her efforts. According to Ellen, James, quote, would cease to eat things which gave evidence of disturbing his stomach, and it took him a long time to find simple graham mush and unleavened cakes without salt, milk, or sugar appetizing. Little wonder. After she would prepare a simple breakfast of mush and gems, James ate but very little because she could not make it very palatable to him. James also admitted he was unable to eat vegetables because his stomach could only handle 3 different kinds of fruit. Beyond this, James resisted a 2-meal-per-day diet and would eat in between meals as often as he could. If James found the staples of 19th century vegetarian diet unpalatable, what sorts of food could he stomach? It seems that he preferred foods high in protein, which an emaciated body needed to regain mass. During the fall of 1866, Ellen White informed her son Edson, your father is appearing some better. We have killed 1 wild black squirrel per day. He enjoys it much. He also preferred cheese, which he ate often in his feebleness. About December 1866, James began to make some progress with his diet. In a letter to Edson, Ellen reported, your father seems much improved. He is gaining victories in regard to his eating. We could not ask him to do better than he has been doing. About 2 months later, Ellen White informed Edson, your father seems much improved in mind, also in body. In regard to his eating, he eats nothing in between meals, and his meals are now very simple. James accomplished these health reform victories in northern Michigan, out of sight from his friends in Battle Creek. But as he started to improve, his eating habits became the joke of the day back at Battle Creek headquarters. In November 1866, Cornelia Cornell wrote to Lucinda Hall, quote, Brother White is just the same. Eat he will. Jane Rogers hid the apples upstairs, and she caught him up there hunting. Jane Rogers was living with the Whites in the Whites' home in Battle Creek at this time with her husband Sanford, while they took care of the property. According to Lucinda Hall, Jane gossiped quite often about James White's eating. However, James was certainly not alone. George W. Amadon later admitted to Ira Abbey, I would say I fear that quite a wrong view had been taken of his, that is James White's case. That is, altogether too much has been said by us and you in regard to his eating, etc. when he was out here in early 1867. Jan Loughborough also made fun of James White during this time. Ellen White remarked that Loughborough, quote, talked and laughed and made himself jovial over the humiliating features of her husband, which was probably a reference to James White's eating. Since James's diet had been scrutinized and since no one in Battle Creek had observed changes to it, his audience probably felt or had difficulty taking him seriously when he talked about health reform during his sermon on sanctification. When James White stood up in the meeting house and discussed the benefits of only 2 meals per day, embracing vegetarianism, and using only graham flour, this congregation likely listened with his food cravings, his food hunts, and in the back of their mind. They had never seen him actually live according to the standards he was now advocating in his sermon, and it would have been easy to view him as inconsistent and hypocritical. Harriet Smith later confessed, quote, "I listened to his preaching with the same feeling that I would listen to a crazy man, with no feelings of love and respect in my heart," end quote. These examples illustrate that after James's resignation, the whites' desire to move to Greenville, and the Sermon on Sanctification, the cold reception that the whites had received turned icy. In this situation, Ellen White acknowledged, "We decided that we could not bear our testimony in this church in Battle Creek till they gave better evidence that they wished our services." The whites did their very best to avoid Battle Creek as much as possible and spent only 5 Sabbaths there in the town throughout the entire year of 1867. Conclusion. There is much more to this story, but for the present time, it must end. Nevertheless, in this narrative, there are several instructive points. First, it is evident that James White's first stroke removed both him and Ellen White from active leadership for an extended period. During his prolonged illness, James White suffered perennial depression and struggled with his diet. This was his struggle, not overbearing leadership style. Second, Ellen White struggled alongside her husband as she faithfully nursed him back to health. She had faith that God would heal her husband, but it was not unshakable. She acknowledged that James White was possibly insane and at times expected his imminent death, even though God had revealed in vision that he would restore James White to health. Finally, understanding the prevalent tension between denominational leaders helps to de-romanticize Adventist history by more accurately reflecting the realities of human experience. Adventists today too often imagine their past through rose-colored glasses. The earliest years of Adventist history were not a golden age, and it is necessary to understand when and how Adventist leaders struggled and even failed in the past. The pioneers were prone to gossip, could be unkind to one another, and sometimes mistrusted and misunderstood one another. Many of them also doubted Ellen White's prophetic gift at times. Acknowledging these weaknesses inspires hope, I believe, because God worked through these faulty women and men to further the mission of the Adventist Church. It should also lead us to personal reflection as we attempt to serve God and minister to one another in our day and age. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burton. That was really insightful and very interesting. I would like to now introduce our respondent, Professor Gerson Rodriguez, who is a Ph.D. candidate in Adventist Studies. Professor Rodriguez is a professor of church history in the Theological Seminary. He's also the director of the Millerite Research Center at the Northeast Brazil College since 2011. Professor Rodriguez has concentrated part of his studies on the relationship of James and Ellen White, and is a co-authored the article, The Conjugal Experience of James and Ellen White, Meaning Built by the Couple. Welcome, Dr. Rodriguez. You have 10 to 15 minutes, I believe, before we will take our break.
All right. Can you hear me? I would like to thank Kevin Burton for his presentation, his research. It was very detailed and right to the point. And also because he talked about a man that the Adventist Church owns much to what he did. I talk about James White. He has been overshadowed in our memories, maybe because of his wife, and also because she outlived him for nearly 34 years. But I like what Elder Uriah Smith said about James White in his funeral, when he said his influence will still be felt, the impress of his shaping hand will still be seen, and all the future workings of this cause will revive and keep alive his memory. And though the paper is not focused in his abilities in administration and his great achievements, even because it talks about a time when James was he was not, though he was the president of the General Conference and other responsibilities, but he was not active in this. But the paper exposed a piece of the life of James and also Ellen, including some details mostly unknown to the majority, including the relationship with some of their closest friends in a very difficult time. And I believe it's important to the Adventist community to become more familiar with the life and struggles of our pioneers. For some people, this kind of presentation would be a revisionist one, and some people could also think that this disconstructing our history. As you overemphasize the human side of Ellen White and even James White, so it leads to the rejection of Ellen White's gift. But I don't think so. I think that become familiar with these stories, it's important, it's necessary for us. And so for me, this presentation is constructive. It presents part of the history that's not very familiar to the church in general. And as Calvin says, one of his purposes is to de-romanticize Adventist history by more accurately reflecting the realities of human experience. And I think that Ellen White would agree with him. In 1903, Ellen White wrote to a friend, and she said, "You are not to treat your life as a romance, but as a reality." So he presented the reality of those 2 years, specifically 1866 and 1867. I also like what Ellen White said in, I don't have the time now, but she was writing about in one of her autobiographical works, she was talking about the childhood spiritual journey that she experienced. And she said, as she was reading some of the religious biographies that was prepared for children, she said that they had possessed numberless virtues and lived faultless lives. These models, instead of encouraging her, were as stumbling blocks to her, although she was struggling to reach a sanctified life. And she affirmed, based on her own experience, that these biographies of immaculate children mislead the young and would confuse the mind of a child. And she would constantly say, quote, "If that is true, I can never be a Christian. I can never hope to be like these children," unquote. So Ellen pointed out that these biographies became more of an impediment than a blessing in the spiritual journey of one who was struggling. A more flesh and bone record would encourage children and also us, as they would see that although they experienced trials, they could overcome through the grace of God. So the paper also presents that to live with a living prophet is not that easy. Sometimes we think, if I had lived with Ellen and James White, it'd be so easy, but it's not that so. Those people, our pioneers, they were people with the same passion, limitation, and weakness as us, and it was presented by Kevin. We know that mood and behavioral changes following a stroke are common and can cause distress for the patient, close relatives, and friends. And these changes can be short or long lasting and were largely ignored in nursing textbooks until the second half of the 20th century. So acknowledgement of these impairments has resulted in the development of new effective interventions nowadays, but that was not the reality in the 19th century America. A stroke can bring frustration, irritability, anger, and worry for the patient, often resulting in increased emotional dependency on other people. Depression is also the emotional outcome most often associated with stroke. And the impact of a stroke on the survivor's personality may be the most difficult for family and friends to understand and become accustomed to. And this affects both the patient and the caregiver. And in this case, James White and also Ellen White, and also people that were close to them. Some survivors of stroke experience They experience apathy and don't seem to care about anything. And people often mistake this for depression because survivors are content to sit and stare at the wall all the day. And according to recent research, the best response to that is to get them active and moving. Give them a choice of what to do or where to go, but make it clear that have to choose to do something. They can't just lie in bed. And as Calvin showed, Ellen White took this initiative to put James on the road, to be moving and working. And this brought some struggle, some difference of opinion between people, even with James' parents. As it was showed the insistence of Ellen White to keep moving, it raises some different opinions. The question is, was Ellen White always right in what she did? In the end, James was recovered, and it was a blessing, though he had more strokes later on, but the paper is focused on this first one. But this brought some struggle between the leadership at the time. Ellen White, during this time, reviewed great leadership. And I also like to bring the point that the leadership of Ellen White, when she took some decisions regarding James White, and this brought some rupture, some difficulties between them and the rest of the Adventists, especially in Battle Creek. But Ellen White, as she wrote in 1866, she says, I felt such a degree of the peace of God and the consolation of his spirit in the happy performance of my duty that I can say from the heart that I would not exchange the blessings and valuable experience I have obtained during these last 6 months for those of the same length of time in any former period of my life. And also she recognized that she had been nearly all her life an invalid, and tenderly and patiently, James White sympathized with and watched over and took care of her when she was suffering. And now she said, now is my time to return. But as Kevin presented, though she puts here in nice words, it was not an easy task. It was a difficult one for James, for her, and also for those involved. And to finish, he mentioned about diet, and his point was to present that the James White was not so faithful to the diet, even the one he was preaching. But also at this time, though it became more problematic later on, in 1867, 1868, 1870, James and Ellen White, during this time that they were quiet and they were not much involved in leadership and in preaching and writing. After that, they also have to work it to bring again what health reform was about, because a lot of people brought a message unbalanced, and they present extremes, and both James and Ellen call this a health deform. So they also had to fight against this. Well, as we see, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has been growing. The message spreads despite of ourselves. As we see and was nicely presented in this paper, we are living in a militant period of the church that will be soon, by the grace of God, be triumphant. My question is, how the church, after this experience, the church members, they strengthen their friendship and put more effort in the mission of spreading the gospel, or this experience brought suspicion, separated them, isolated them, something that was never healed anymore? Did this experience, this difficult one, strengthen the ministry of James and Ellen White, or it brought a fracture between them and also their friends, that was never healed. So thank you, Kevin, for your presentation. I think it made us to think about, and I agree with you that it brings our pioneers close to us. And for me, it's also a hope to understand that our pioneers had their struggle and we are in the same boat as God helped them. So God is with us as well. Thank you.
We'll give you a few minutes to respond, Dr. Burton.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. I appreciated those comments very much. I'm glad that you too see it in the spirit that I intended as a way to build up. I think that, especially now, I think we live in an age, and I think we have for a long time actually, where people are actually encouraged when we see people fail. And that's because we knew Ellen White ultimately was successful, right? We know that she was used by God throughout her whole life and that she ultimately doesn't fail. But when we see her fail in points and along the way, and James and others, we can say, well, maybe there's hope for us, right? Because we know we fail. And so I hope and pray that other people received it in that light. And I thank you for reading it in that light as well. I don't need to say a whole lot more, but it does appear that you had a good question at the end there that I will just simply say, you're sort of wanting to know what happens next. What happens after this between the whites and the leaders? Do things get sort of patched up and healed, or do people fall away, or what happens? So first of all, I will say that I'm planning, Lord willing, to continue this story next year at the next symposium, if I'm asked to present it at least. And so you can find out in more detail what happens, but I will tell you as a spoiler alert that there is a lot more controversy between the whites and other leaders. There's high points in that point in the next coming years, but it's going to take a long time, a long time for things to get resolved. And I'm not sure if things ever become peaceful until James White died. And even after that, I'm not sure that's peaceful, because things between Ellen and other leaders are often tense. But I don't want you to think that there's like a constant battle, like all this gossip going back and forth. I think that 1867 was probably the worst year of that experience for the whites. I should say late 1866, 1867, the period I just shared with you. And there is going to be major tension. The whites are going to be put on trial by the Battle Creek Church on a number of occasions in the 1860s and 1870s. And this is going to leak out of the Adventist Church and cause tension among other leaders. And then it will eventually lead to the stuff I've discussed in my master's thesis, where in order to try to resolve this, George I. Butler, president of the GC, tries to say, well, we've got a centralized authority and one person, James White, and he comes up with sort of a papal kind of understanding of church leadership. And that becomes official church policy for many years, several years, and it will eventually be voted out, thankfully. But it's a major struggle and challenge. These are issues that I'm discussing. They are issues that prevent the mission of the church from spreading as soon as at least James and Ellen wanted it to. They wanted to send someone to Europe in the 1860s, much before this, but it wouldn't happen until 1874 with J. N. Andrews going there. They wanted to have Battle Creek College started sooner. They wanted to have the Pacific Press launched sooner, but all of those things are finally going to get resolved in 1874 when there's a period of peace that finally allows these things to happen. So the good news is that ultimately, even though the whites struggled with all the people I mentioned, Jane Andrews, Jan Loughborough, their wives, spouses, Uriah Smith, they do remain good friends. Even if there's some tension sometimes, they had a good and abiding friendship. And so none of these things that I've described led people out of the church, at least in any sort of numbers. I cannot even name one to you. And so they don't lead any of the leaders away from the whites. So hopefully that helps. If you want to know more, I'll continue the story in the future, maybe next year.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burton, for beautifully narrating this story and highlighting humanizing these pioneers. And also thank you, Professor Rodriguez, also for highlighting the challenges that leaders face within their work. So thank you all for being here. We're going to take a 25-minute break where you can stretch your legs and have a drink, have a cup of tea, or, and come back here at 4 o'clock to continue this session. Thank you for being here, and see you soon. Bye.